This conversation on the next generation of giving will be led by Moira Forbes, Executive Vice President of Forbes, and feature 3 philanthropists. Please welcome Emma Bloomberg, Founder and CEO of Murmuration, Spencer Eccles, Chairman and CEO of the Eccles Foundation, and Dr. Stephen Shaya, Managing Director of Akkad Holdings and Executive Servant Leader at J&B Medical.
The next generation of philanthropists we'll be hearing from in just a moment are reinventing what it means to do good. Each of them has a unique vision and strategy in their efforts to address some of the world's most intractable problems. We'll be discussing how they're tackling issues that are important to them and the strategies behind those efforts that all of us can learn from as we think about having an impact in the world around us. Joining me is Emma Bloomberg, Spencer Eccles, and Dr. Stephen Shaya. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
I want to start off because the theme of this session is around the next generation of philanthropy, and the profile of today's philanthropists is changing in markedly different ways. It's not necessarily just writing a check. There's a desire for real and measurable results, and also harnessing the power of the private sector or other industries to bring to bear in the philanthropic space. Stephen, I want to start with you, sort of set the frame of this conversation. How do you think about and how do you define this concept of giving in 2021 in terms of how you approach philanthropy and also its evolution in terms of what people are looking for around how to have the greatest impact?
Thank you, Moira. And first, I wanted to thank the Cura Foundation, Robin Smith, and my fellow panelists for this opportunity. So thank you, everyone. So the way we look, and my family looks at giving, is we break it into 2 different areas. There's charity, which is a little more emotional and it's more focused on rescue and relief, and philanthropy, which is much more strategic and a long-term thinking. There's a Hebrew word called tzedakah, which means giving, and there's an implication of social justice, and there's also an implication that you become closer to your faith when you give. Impact investing really means to us, it's very closely tied into a parable that Jesus gave to the disciples about the sower and the seeds. And that a farmer sends his seeds indiscriminately. Some of the seeds land on rock. Some of the seeds land on decent soil, and some of the seeds land on fertile soil. So the seeds that land on the rock, kind of like charitable giving with no focus, with no purpose, and the intention is good, but you don't really get the impact. There's no leverage, there's no catalytic type of effect. The good soil equates to the high leverage, catalytic type of environment in which you can get a lot of different impactful type of changes: job creation, self-sufficiency, social justice, environmental protection, upward mobility, economic empowerment to people and families and ecosystems, professional fulfillment, self-esteem, and so many other type of benefits. So for us, it really where we see that parable, and it kind of reminds us of our giving, that not only do you want to give, but you want to put it on the right soil so that it can grow exponentially. And we're only human when we see the humanity and help elevate the lives of other people. We truly believe that. There's so much more to giving than just writing a check. It's really putting your heart, your soul, your spirit into it. And that's when we talk about giving, that's how we see it.
I think you bring up a great point that it's this obviously something that is very personal, giving of your heart, but also thinking about in certain instances around how to have the greatest scale and impact or sustain change around issues that may be important to you. Spencer, I'll turn to you. You come from a very philanthropic family. When you look at the communities that you serve, it's in the healthcare systems, arts, cultural institutions, preservation projects, and the like. And there's a lot of interest and work in really supporting the communities around you. How do you approach philanthropy and evaluate need and giving? And has there been an evolution over the years in terms of how you look at to have the greatest impact with the money, the resources, and the time that you all invest in these communities?
Well, thanks for asking a question, Moira. I really appreciate it. I love the way Stephen framed it, where he talks about good seeds and then also where you plant those seeds. And for us, when we think about it, first of all, there's 5 key principles: focus, the need, the impact, the sustainability, and then the personal involvement that Stephen just ended on. And as you think about focus, the originators of many of the foundations we're involved with, including our own family, started with really delineating where we wanted to put our attention. You mentioned some of the areas: arts and culture, community, education, health and wellness, preservation, conservation. That's one of the focal points of one of the foundations we're involved with. And I kind of hark back to this quote from George S. Eccles, who was the founder of one of the foundations, the George and Dolores Doré Eccles Foundation, where he says, "It is our duty to be mindful of our responsibilities and the problems that confront this country and pledge ourselves to aid in every possible way." And I think that is the core. When you think about the need, where is the greatest need? Being able to focus in on that. But again, that focus and then driving in on the need, and then the impact. Where do you utilize your dollars? And finally, when you think about sustainability, how can you be a catalyst for good? And that's one of the key areas for us, whether it's first dollars in or matching dollars or last dollar in, based on moving the foundation or the nonprofit that's looking for dollars, helping them move forward. And that's the key at the end of the day for us, is not just the impact, but is it sustainable? And in some cases, it shouldn't be. Some cases, you just have to fill a need. But in other cases, you definitely want to see what the sustainability is and who else is joining in, and how can we kind of broaden the bench and broaden the effort so that it's not just relying upon one group of funders. And then on the other side of that sustainability, how can you ensure that the nonprofit or the group that's out there looking for the dollars, how can you help them become more self-sufficient? I think that's the end goal.
You bring up a great point that there's this desire to have, I think, an evolving intentionality in terms of who and how you give, in the sense of really understanding the reasons behind it. To your point, the catalytic effect, the stakeholders involved, but really thinking, I would imagine, from a much holistic perspective in terms of where and how to leverage your philanthropic opportunities within your communities. Emma, I'd be curious, in chatting with you, you sit at a really interesting intersection. Philanthropic experiences. You have experience as a philanthropist. You're a board member at Bloomberg Philanthropy that works towards ensuring better, longer lives to the greatest number of people and across so many different dimensions, but really that scale. But you also started Murmuration, which is a really interesting organization in the ways in which you mobilize political campaigns, advocates, and organizers to in support of communities, and really around the opportunity to have the greatest access to high quality public education. Can you talk about the differences of those experiences and how one informs the other in terms of thinking about really maximizing philanthropic giving, but also strategies and organizations to be the vehicle to do that?
Absolutely. I think to me, the important thing really is to have philanthropy and programmatic support working as cooperatively as possible. One of the things we're increasingly trying to do at Murmuration is to help to coordinate the strategies of our partner organizations, funders, and our partners themselves, right? So funders, myself included, right? We seek out these organizations because we have a deep belief in the change that we want to see in the world, but we're not the experts to actually do it, right? They're the ones on the ground actually affecting the change. And so for Murmuration, as an example, we have partners on the ground who are running organizing and advocacy and electoral campaigns. And sometimes there's this issue where funders have their set of metrics, and those metrics aren't necessarily aligned with how to run the most effective campaigns over time. So, you sort of very generously said I sit at this really interesting intersection. I do think it's an interesting intersection because one of the things that I'm increasingly getting to do is to really try to build that bridge between the organizations and the funders, and really help funders and organizations identify metrics that provide funders with the comfort that their dollars are actually affecting change, but that also really help our partners become more effective over time. We want to help our partners develop the most effective political strategy and run smarter campaigns, and funders need to understand the potential for those efforts to drive impact. So I guess, I'd say you can't do any of the work without the investment and the money, but you also won't get the impact without the planning and execution. And, we just need to think about how we fit those pieces together every time we make a grant.
I think you make such a good point in terms of when we think about this giving ecosystem, there is and I love that sort of analogy of you all being the bridge. I think there is a huge need to be able to align stakeholders and align incentives so that you can really have the momentum and the sustainability around giving. And we're seeing a lot of that alignment obviously now, I think, in the business sector as well, where leaders of some of today's most dynamic organizations are in this really privileged position where, as technology and their global reach are giving them greater power and opportunity, there's a chance for them to create social value and to really contribute and infuse purpose in their organizations and contribute in communities in ways that really were not part of DNAs of organizations before. Stephen, you run Akkad Holdings, which is a family office that invests in various areas. As you think about investment in the private sector, how much weight do you give that sense of purpose or community responsibility into the investment decisions that you're making around how to improve the world? And can you talk a little bit about the importance of catalytic capital?
Well, I think most funders are looking at different ways where their capital is going to be transformational. And to Spence's point, is going to be sustainable. I think sustainability is very, very important. A lot of, I think philanthropy is evolving that in that the sense that there are certain things for me being in the healthcare space where people are looking at making investments, being the initial risk taker in new kind of drug development opportunities, where maybe traditional investors would see it as high risk, but other people are looking at it as how do we solve some of the biggest problems? How do we make change happen? And I think philanthropists are really looking more and more at collaborating. And I think catalytic capital to me is the capital that can be the initial capital, but help bring various leaders in government and businesses and help bring everyone together. Emma talks about alignment. To me, that's one of the biggest problems in philanthropy. You have this family and this group doing something. You have that stakeholder doing something else. Bringing everyone together and maximizing and optimizing something that'll be not only sustainable, but lasting and maximize effectiveness has been very, very difficult. So I think that catalytic capital, the force of capital, really is critical. So I'll give you an example. In Rwanda, there was a program that started in October of 2017 around nutrition, some nutritional programs for mothers. A donor, donated $10 million to that. And that initial capital became $116 million over 4 years. And the Rwandan government was able to build a whole nutritional program, education, and awareness that has been able to help move the needle, particularly around mothers. So the force of capital cannot be underestimated, but the key to Emma's point is alignment. How do you get the government, the philanthropist, and all the business folks together and all rowing in the same direction?
We're talking about these forces that are changing the dynamics of philanthropy. Stephen, you're talking about this desire for alignment. Spencer, so much of the work that you guys are focused on are in the communities that your family is a part of, bringing private and public sector efforts together. I'd be curious, when we think about these forces that are changing philanthropy moving forward, and this desire to understand where are the most pressing needs, and how do we really think about this concept of catalyzing opportunity, investing in philanthropic models of the future. I'd be curious how the pandemic has influenced how you think about giving and working within the communities that you serve.
Well, I appreciate that. Thinking about what Emma said and what Stephen kind of expanded on, as you think about alignment, as you think about synergy, when COVID hit, we were all just absolutely shell-shocked. And as we looked around as a family, where was the need? And at that moment, there weren't a lot of people coming to us necessarily. Where sometimes as a philanthropist or in the foundations, you're catcher's mitt. You just wait for things to come to you. There are other times when you have to be a hunter. You have to look for the problem and search to find out how to solve it. And we saw just an absolute overwhelming volume of information pouring in, conflicting, complex, very difficult to navigate. And so at that moment, we very quickly talked as a family, which we meet very regularly. And I contacted the dean of the David Eccles School of Business, and then I followed up with Mike Leavitt, former Utah governor, and he later served as the Secretary of Health and Human Services under George W. Bush, where he formulated, with a $7 billion budget, a pandemic plan. And within 2 weeks, we had funded and pulled in a few other parties to help with that, but funded a series, executive education series, titled COVID-19, How to Save Your Business. We started on April 3rd. We ended on May 29th. We did 15 series. And in that, we had over 17 or 18,000 views of Utahns, business leaders, and not just business, but also nonprofits, trying to help them navigate this terrible pandemic, but from the real human business side. And the number one goal was to provide immediate assistance to the business leaders and the nonprofit leaders by helping them reframe this daunting economic landscape that was facing them, and to share actionable, timely tools that they could take and immediately that day, the second they got off the video chat that we had and the training, and implement that in their business. And we knew that businesses needed to get their foot on a rock. So with that, we ended up also having Senator Mitt Romney on, Randall Quarles, a former Undersecretary of Domestic Finance and the Vice Chair of Supervision for the Fed, and others, as well as business leaders that were in the trenches, sharing their experiences of what they went through both in 2008 and now during the pandemic. And I think the result was pretty helpful and immediate for those businesses. But it required us to get involved in a very, very personal level as individuals and helping drive that forward.
I think it really is an example of when there is an urgent need, the ability to mobilize resources. One of the really sort of unique moments and roles that philanthropy can play, but also to your point, the different leaders that you brought together in service of this effort in order to really power it and drive it in the most, in the most impactful way. Emma, as we talk about COVID-19, obviously, the public education system has been one of the potential, fallouts of or areas of huge, conflict and really, in a very, very difficult situation coming out of this pandemic. But you've created an organization that takes a very, very interesting model in where you have really engaged the political sector and are helping power, the political and policy sector as a lever of transformation and education, but doing so from a philanthropy perspective. When we think about all the different levers of change and how to think about our giving efforts, can you talk about the dynamics of politics and policy and putting that at the forefront of an effort?
Absolutely. For some issues, and education is sort of an obvious one, the decisions that impact kids on a daily basis, they're being made by elected officials, and particularly at the local level. So if you want to ensure that those decisions are being made with the right focus, you need allies in key positions, and politics allows for that to happen. But beyond the actual electing of people, politics drives news, it drives the media narrative, it drives public interest. All of these things help to build attention and influence, and that can then be leveraged to really push for change. At Murmuration, our theory of change is really grounded in the idea that people and communities should have a say in shaping their public school systems. And so our focus and sort of broad definition of politics is really on that, right? On empowering the people in communities least well served by the current system. And those communities also tend to be those that are most likely to be disenfranchised or left out of our political system. And so we work to give them power through the democratic process. And I would say, I think as you talk about different levers, yes, politics is the one that we're pulling, but it's not that different from direct service. You have to think about the direct service that we're providing is really, giving organizations and people in communities the access to power through democracy.
As we begin to wrap up this conversation, all of you are very, very obviously deeply committed in terms of the giving space and understanding how to create the greatest scale and impact and efficiency to transform, communities and societies at large. I just want to end by asking each of you, what's been one of the greatest insights or lessons learned in terms of how you have become a more impactful philanthropist in the work that you're doing in a way that can give others insight or again a lesson in terms of how they can go about their own work or their own commitments in this space. Stephen, I'll start with you.
So philanthropy is evolving just like every aspect of life, and truly believe that we all need to look at philanthropy with a fresh perspective. There have been some very interesting, I'll say, innovative approaches, particularly around venture philanthropy. I'll give you a real life example. The Cystic Fibrosis Foundation invested $150 million into a drug development, Catalytic, which ended up selling, which was made by Vertex Pharmaceuticals, sold to Royalty Pharma over a 10-year period for $3.3 billion. So the efforts around cystic fibrosis now are supercharged to help people live, healthier, more fulfilled lives. And so, but what was interesting about that is that the vehicle, which was a donor-advised, donor-advised fund, is not the traditional way of looking at philanthropy. Most people think you give money to a foundation, and the foundation has rules. They give a certain percentage away every year. But is there a way to take philanthropy and supercharge it like the cystic fibrosis folks did? And so I think that all of us need to look at philanthropy in a different way. And it's not just giving away money. How can you take what you're giving and make it exponentially more effective? And I think there's a lot more opportunities around that, Moira, than we realize. And I'm just learning every day from very smart people like we have on the panel here. But I think there's a lot more of those opportunities, and we can really do a lot more good in the world in so many creative and intentional and meaningful ways.
Yeah, you bring a great point though, that you have to keep a fresh, open mind and continuing to stay curious and really be open to the learnings that exist, not just in the philanthropic sector, but across so many industries that then can be harnessed behind these efforts. Spencer, what about yourself?
Oh, well, I think one of the core components for us as a family has been purpose and mission driven. And one of the things that you see over time is not only an evolution of the giving, but sometimes there's some negative impacts that can split apart the effort to give. And having clarity around the mission of the foundation, having clarity around that, then unifying around that purpose. And if everybody can sink their teeth into that purpose and really stay focused there, then individual individual interests that could pull away from that will eventually become aligned. You can stay together as a family, for example, for us, and that is one of the key things. So the focus on our mission is what has held us together, and is what has held the foundations together. And if you want to have a sustainable foundation that not only can evolve over time, but also can maintain its purpose, that is a key to driving it forward. But you also have to have some flexibility in the mandate. So that those two things work closely together, and I think that allows a foundation to evolve over time.
I love that, having your North Star in terms of vision and mission, but being flexible in terms of how you can bring that to life in so many different ways. Emma, I'll close with you. Is there an insight or lesson learned for you that's been particularly transformative in your work within the sector?
Yeah, I'll touch on two, I think. First, my advice is always to look at the opportunities to invest in infrastructure, right? I think programs tend to get more of the sort of public attention, but whether you're talking about political infrastructure or really any other kind of infrastructure, organizations to be successful, they need data and intelligence. They need the ability to share information, to share metrics, to fundraise, to communicate, to create efficiencies. All of that relies on infrastructure. And so investing in that is then allowing those organizations to be more effective and more efficient in actually driving the change that you want to see. And then the other thing I'll just touch on, we've said this a few times throughout this panel. Stephen, I particularly liked your use of the word alignment. But to me, I think a lot about coordination, right? And I think you don't need to fund every organization that cares about the issue that you are prioritizing, right? That you can absolutely pick the ones that you think can drive the most impact. But I think it's important to understand the full landscape of who's working in that space, and to think about what cooperation looks like among funders and among the organizations who are actually doing the work on the ground. I think oftentimes organizations feel some pressure from funders to say, my work created this impact, right? But more often than not, it's their work and the work of a number of organizations that they are cooperating with. And for us as funders to be interested in that and to embrace that and to encourage that means that our investment in one organization can actually have ripple effects across lots of organizations in that same space.
I love that. I think you all bring up so many great points around this desire to have clarity, intentionality, but really communication. Communication at the core to understand goals and objectives, and to bring everyone together around the same mission. I think the wonderful thing is there is so much passion around these causes and issues, and the key, Emma, as you talked about, is how do you build those bridges to connect these stakeholders together and to get everyone rowing in the same direction and together in a much stronger way. So Emma, Stephen, Spencer, thanks so much for your insights, very, very helpful perspectives, and appreciate you joining this conversation.
Thank you so much, Moira.
Thank you.
Thank you,
everyone.